Welcome, everyone. What you're about to hear is a 2.5 hour compilation of every single episode of Global we have ever done. It's covering units 1 through 9. This is going to be 2.5 hours, so buckle up and get ready to review. Welcome to Global, everyone. We have a lot of stuff to get to, so this is going to be Unit 1, and then we'll move into Unit 2, and 3, 4. It's going to go chronological order, so we're starting here with Unit 1. So let's do it. We start off today with the Paleolithic Era, known as the Stone Age. It's the time period from the evolution of the genus, or the Homo species, that is human-like being. So the genus Homo, that's just pretty much humans, when we went from apes to real human-like creatures, the cavemen, to around 9,000 BCE, when modern-day humans started to farm and started to get into farming, agriculture, that kind of stuff. And that leads us to the Neolithic Revolution, which was a bigger deal, but even possibly a bigger deal than the Paleolithic era, which went from 2 million to 9,000 BCE. And the rest of human history after the start of farming is a 16th of the time period that we have spent in the Paleolithic era. So it took us a long time to get here. Rome wasn't built in a day, neither was the human existence. It took us a long time to get here. So Neolithic era means when we stopped traipsing around after our sources of food and started planting it, leading to a surplus and more healthier, happier, more filled up people who had more food, more nourishment, which is very nice. So, yeah, people began to expand. People's lives began to expand and get better quite quickly, which was very nice. So, yeah, and another big thing here is the landforms. Landforms are another big thing that we want to focus about from the first unit. And here, I want to take some time to talk about some of the ones you may not know. An archipelago is a group of chain islands clustered together in a sea or an ocean. A delta is an area formed by a soil deposited at the mouth of a river, for example, the Nile River in Egypt, which we will get to. A desert is something that you probably already know is an island is a small part of a body of water that reaches into a coast. A peninsula is a piece of land that is surrounded by water on 3 sides. A plateau is a large area of high land that is flat or gently rolling. A river is a large stream of water that empties into a ocean, a lake, or another river. And a strait is a narrow channel of water that connects to larger bodies of water. All right, so those are some of the landforms you need to know. We know about Paleolithic, which was pretty much the time before farming, and Neolithic Revolution, which was when we started farming, and things got amazing. Now we want to talk about some of the civilizations in this area that took place at this time. Yeah, so now we're going to turn the tide to civilizations. We start with Egypt, one of the biggest civilizations out there. You probably all heard of it. It's been the subject of a lot of stories. It gets a lot of credit, not as much as some of the other civilizations, but that's okay. Some of the main geographical features and you're going to find this in a lot of the civilizations, all the civilizations pretty much. You're going to cover the Nile River, some sort of body of water there that pretty much provided nourishment to the civilization, and it gave the civilization a lot of support, whether it be through crops, whether it be through water, and because as we know, back at that time, crops was a very important way of living. Fertile soil and predictable flooding of the river really helped, and also a lot of access to the Mediterranean Sea helped as well. And of course, the Nile River Delta was heaven for farming, pretty much. So yeah, some of the religious things with Egypt centered around pyramids, which were tombs for eternity for mummies and pharaohs that we know, and they also believed in the afterlife and the process, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, of mummification. Polytheistic was the name, the type of religion. They believed in multiple gods. Amun-Re, Osiris, Isis, Horus is one of them. So pretty much the thing with their afterlife was they had an eternal life after death, and the soul had to pass a test to get in. Some of their technology, they used mathematics, limestone, drainage. They had some pretty good drainage projects, so written language and hieroglyphics, materials like paper, like papyrus and the Rosetta Stone, which helped historians later on interpret their language, medicine, math, wall paintings, and tombs, as well as astronomy. The Middle Kingdom, which was what they called the kingdom in Egypt back then, it began to expand and trade with Crete, which was Greece, and they occupied a nearby land called Nubia. Some of the dynasties, which the ruling families, was how their government worked. It was a dynasty that would rule for like however many years and pass on leadership from generation to generation, which within one family. Egypt generally remained united, and the rulers were called pharaohs. They had a strong centralized government with divine support for their rule, another common theme throughout literally the entire year. Divine support for their rules, again, yeah, it's a big thing. The pharaoh was considered a god, but he was expected to behave morally. A vizier was kind of like his, it was kind of like the governor. He was a tax collector. He was a head of farming and irrigation system. The scribes recorded things. The theocracy was present as well. So the pharaoh was a religious authority. And some of the social classes there were peasant farmers. The majority of the population, the rise of craftsmen with some trade going on, which is kind of the middle class. And Egyptian women also had some higher status than in other civilizations, which is pretty good stuff. So now we turn our attention to the ancient Indus civilization, which is a pretty big deal, because one of the main things that we know about the Indus was we didn't know a lot about them because their language was indecipherable, but we do know they had very organized and structural grid-like cities, which was pretty nice. You like to see that happen, and they had some of the most advanced plumbing systems out there. So every house pretty much had a toilet, a shower. They had a toilet and a private bathroom. I shouldn't say shower. Very, very quickly, which was incredible stuff. This was also in a river valley. The cities again were grid patterns. They were on the Indus River. That was a river. They were polytheistic. They had two gods, and they built many statues of the gods to worship, which is called an effigy. Yeah, they had the great sewer systems that we talked about. They had bridges and running water with canals, and they had complex bath system and drains. It was amazing for sanitation and for health in the end. And they also had some pretty well done and organized streets. They traded with Sumerians across the Arabian Sea, their partners in the Mesopotamian, Sumer or Mesopotamia, whatever you want to call them, and we'll get to that next. Traded cloth and crops, and the merchants used weights and measures as currency. They kind of had a traditional bartering economy. They traded with other nations to maximize supply and demand. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro ruled the rest of the civilization. So those were two city-states, and the church and state were not separate at the time, and city planning was done by the government. So they had standardized houses. Everyone kind of had the same house, which is made of baked clay bricks. So that's kind of how they ruled there. It wasn't a big, elaborate, fancy house, except for the ruler. I'm assuming had a little bit of a nicer house than most. So now we turn our attention over to the Mesopotamians. We all know about the Mesopotamians to some degree, and we're just going to take the time to go over them right now. And yeah, so here's what we know about the Mesopotamians. They're presently in present day. The land that they're in right now is Iraq. They have the Fertile Crescent. They did not have one river. They had two, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which meant fertile soil from the silt and the flood waters. The flooding was unpredictable, so I mean your crops could be there and washed one day and washed away the next day. And there was also a few natural barriers which made them susceptible to invasion. And I mean, let's be honest, it still does today. Polytheistic was their religious structure. Gods were thought to control every aspect of the life, like especially forces of nature, which could be affecting their crops, which is pretty much their main way of life. Gods were believed to behave like humans, and they had temples called ziggurats, which soared towards the heavens. And some of the most complex structures that they ever produced. So technology, they had dams, dikes, and irrigation systems. Sumerians may have been the first to invent the wheel as well. They had cuneiform, which they made wedge shapes marked in clay tablets, which grew from pictographs. They recorded economic exchanges, myths, prayers, laws, business contracts, and they also had scribes to do those things. Cuneiform, one of the first written languages ever created. So it was like, wow. So they also utilized trade. They sailed across rivers and traded again with the Indus, as we just discussed. They traveled through the desert, and they also maybe traded with Egypt a little bit as well. Their rulers lived in palaces, and the ziggurats were also kind of the city hall. They had a monarchy, which is a form of government in which one person, such as the king or queen, had complete authority. Their highest class was the ruling family. Small middle class was scribes, merchants, and artisans. And the majority of people were peasant farmers, and women had a low legal status, but not as low as slaves. And, of course, you know about Hammurabi's Code, one of the early law systems there, eye for an eye, what you do, I do, and what you do to me, I do to you, that kind of situation, and some pretty tough punishments for law breaking. So, yeah, there were tens of thousands city-states. Some of the great cities were Ur and Uruk. There was a palace for the ruler, and artisans worked throughout the streets. And this is something you may still hear about today. It was a bazaar. It was a workshop lined streets with a bunch of stores, stuff like that. So buildings were made of bricks of clay, and they lacked materials to make those buildings, such as that you may have thought were that should be made were timber and stone. They didn't have those materials that much, so they weren't able to make them. Ziggurats were by far the biggest buildings there, and they kind of had an interesting structure, which was not very comprehensive. It was kind of a mess. It was kind of all over the place and not really discernible. All right, we're going to move on quickly now to a discussion now about Mesopotamia. Greece. That would be Greece. Excuse me. So Greece is made up of many islands. What is that, class? Whoa, sorry. It's an archipelago. So it was made up of city-states bordered by the Mediterranean and Aegean Sea. Polytheistic, they believed in many gods such as Zeus, Apollo, and Poseidon. They had traditional stories like myths explaining nature. They had Zeus, Mount Olympus, that kind of thing. We all have heard about it. Once, like Percy Jackson, if you read that series when you were younger. They had skilled sailors in the military, and which made sense because they had to communicate between all those islands, and a strong military and a fighting style called the phalanx. They had a token economy where one thing represented a value with currency. They traded with other civilizations. Some of the key exports were olive oil, wine, and marble. They improved and expanded upon the Phoenician alphabet, a civilization which they kind of merged on. They had a government with ruling nobles and a king or queen, and an oligarchy where the power went to a rich elite and then eventually kind of turned into a little bit of a democracy there. They had like 1,000 city-states cut off by water and mountains. It was not a very united place. And included the city and the surrounding countryside. The polis was what they called the city-state. So the Acropolis was a high city with marble temples to the gods. They featured a marketplace and theater, etc., etc., etc. So they also had they were big into dramas, plays, shows of art, and things of that nature, which was a big deal. And some of the things we rely on the Greeks from today. It was something we think of when we think of Greece. We think of big plays, big amphitheaters, and they had a very strong and vibrant culture, which is some pretty cool stuff. Finally, we have the Yellow Civilization. It was isolated from the rest of the world because of natural barriers, the Gobi Desert and the Himalayan mountains. Those are some pretty big natural barriers, trust me. The Yellow River was unpredictable. It flooded. It changed its course, and it was filled with loess or yellow sediment that ruined all the crops. It's obviously in modern-day China. It was polytheistic. It believed in many gods and the mandate of heaven, which was the god given right to rule, and started the trend of dynasties which continued in China for many years to come. Calligraphy was first started there. It was a uniform system of writing. Dikes, canals, and channels, they were very prevalent in that society. They used bronze and iron tools, plows, and they used those to make roads. Some of the main products there was silk, and their monetary system, which was a solid system, which was copper coins, which they used to trade. Some of their social classes were kind of an early method of feudalism. the royal family and nobles had